photograph arrived at the National Archives Victorian Family Studies Department on a bitterly cold February morning in 2024. And Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a respected scholar specializing in 19th century family documentation, carefully slid the fragile piece from the archival envelope that had been forwarded by the estate of the late collector Harold Peaton. At first glance, the image seemed to be nothing more than a standard Victorian baby portrait taken in 1898. An elegantly dressed infant seated upright in an ornate high chair, surrounded by the artificial but painstakingly arranged studio props popular during that era. The baby, who appeared to be between 8 and 10 months old, wore a flowing white christening gown of the kind favored by prosperous families, its sleeves and collar trimmed with delicate lace, while a neat row of tiny pearl buttons gleamed faintly down the front. His small hands were folded with an almost ceremonial care in his lap, and the posture so unusually rigid for a child that age betrayed the likely presence of a hidden brace or support apparatus, an accepted though unsettling trick employed by many Victorian photographers to keep infants still during lengthy exposures. Another from the Peaton collection, remarked Dr. Mitchell's assistant Anna Rodriguez as she flipped through the documentation enclosed with the photograph. This particular picture, she noted, had been tucked inside a family Bible belonging to the Whitmores of Boston, and a handwritten note suggested it was their infant son, photographed at the Morrison studio in September of 1898. Dr. Mitchell proceeded with her customary inspection, positioning the photograph beneath her magnifying glass to evaluate its preservation and verify its authenticity. The clarity was remarkable. The image, nearly pristine, and the craftsmanship of the photograph hinted at both the technical skill of the photographer and the advanced quality of the studio equipment. The elaborate painted backdrop roses intertwined with classical columns further signaled the affluence of the Whitmores, who, like other wealthy Boston families, patronized only the city's most fashionable portraitists. Yet as Dr. Mitchell's magnifying glass drifted over the child's face, a sudden shiver traced the length of her spine. Victorian infant portraits usually bore the same look. Vacant eyes, unfocused stares, the dull absence of awareness natural to very young children. This child, however, stared directly at the lens with a startling intensity, a gaze that seemed far too deliberate for one so small what unsettled Dr. Mitchell most was not the awareness, but the haunting expression that lingered within those eyes, an unmistakable glimmer of suffering that made her hands tremble against the desk. "Anna," she whispered, her voice edged with unease. "I need you to see this." Together they leaned over the image, and under the magnifying glass, the child's eyes betrayed details even more disturbing. Unlike the usual bright or cloudy gaze captured in portraits of the time, these eyes bore pin-prick pupils that should not have existed under the generous lighting conditions of the studio. And beneath them, faint but undeniable dark shadows traced hollows that no healthy infant should have carried a mark of exhaustion, illness, or something far more troubling. The whites of the infant's eyes carried the faintest yellow tinge, a detail nearly invisible against the sepia tones of the original print, but unmistakable beneath magnification. "Look at his expression, Dr. Mitchell whispered to Anna, her voice low and unsettled. "This isn't the sharp alertness of a thriving child. There's something hollow in that gaze." Anna bent over the magnifying glass, her face blanching as she studied the image. "It's as if he's staring straight through the lens," she murmured. "And his skin." She paused, carefully adjusting the focus to account for the limitations of 19th century photographic methods. "It looks waxy, almost translucent, as though there's no warmth left in it." Alarm prickled at Dr. Mitchell's nerves as she retrieved her high-resolution digital camera, photographing the portrait and transferring the files onto her computer for closer analysis. When she heightened the contrast and adjusted the brightness, the troubling details sharpened into stark relief. The infant's skin tone was not the fashionable pallor so admired in Victorian portraits, but an unnatural grayish cast, an unhealthy undertone that seemed to whisper of serious illness, or worse. I need to research infant mortality and common childhood diseases in Boston during 1898, Dr. Mitchell said tensely, her suspicion hardening. But first, I want to know everything about the Morrison photography studio and the Whitmore family. She had examined countless historical portraits, enough to recognize when a photograph captured more than surface appearances. This was no simple commemoration of a baby in fine clothing. It was evidence preserved on glass and paper, a record of a child suffering in silence. The infant's unyielding stare seemed less like a pose and more like a wordless plea for help across a gulf of more than 100 years, and Dr. Mitchell felt an obligation to decipher its meaning. Her investigation began at the Boston Public Library's archives, where she traced the history of Morrison Photography Studio. What emerged was a portrait of one of the most esteemed establishments in the city, a studio that catered exclusively to Boston's wealthiest families who demanded grand artistic images of their children. Founded in 1892 by Edgar Morrison on Beacon Hill, the studio quickly rose to prominence its advertisements in the Boston Herald, promising angelic portraits that captured childhood innocence, while assuring parents that even the youngest subjects would remain calm and still. Yet the deeper Dr. Mitchell probed into Morrison's reputation, the more troubling the undertones became. Hidden between the lines of social notes and reviews were unsettling hints that his ability to pacify restless infants extended beyond charm or skill. A society journal in 1897 praised him for possessing an almost magical ability to render even the most fidgety infants perfectly docile and compliant during his sessions, a remark that struck Dr. Mitchell less as admiration and more as an ominous clue. More alarming than the society praise was an advertisement Dr. Mitchell uncovered from 1898, in which Morrison boasted of employing the latest medicinal techniques to ensure infant comfort during extended portrait sittings. In an era when exposures could last several minutes, such promises carried a chilling implication, for by the late 19th century, some photographers had begun resorting to questionable practices to keep their smallest subjects unnaturally still. Her unease deepened when she located a medical journal article published in 1899 by Boston pediatrician Dr. James Thornfield. In the piece, Thornfield voiced growing concern over the use of narcotic substances by commercial photographers seeking to sedate infants during sessions. Although he refrained from naming specific studios, his warning was, stark parents should be wary of any photographer who could guarantee a child's unnaturally docile behavior before a camera. The warning echoed ominously when Dr. Mitchell unearthed a forgotten newspaper notice in the Boston Herald, dated October 1898, just a month after the Whitmore baby's portrait had been taken. The brief item reported that the infant daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Hamilton had expired suddenly following a visit to a Beacon Hill photography studio. According to the report, the family physician had demanded an investigation into the mysterious decline, yet no follow-up articles ever appeared, suggesting that the matter had been quietly dismissed or deliberately suppressed. The date, the location, and the circumstances all pointed directly to Morrison's operation, and with each connection, Dr. Mitchell's suspicion hardened into dread. It seemed increasingly likely that Edgar Morrison had relied on dangerous sedatives to achieve his reputation for placid infant portraits, and that the Whitmore baby's unsettling gaze had preserved on film the effects of such tampering. Determined to learn more, Dr. Mitchell pursued genealogical records and combed through Boston's archives until she reconstructed the tragic story behind the haunting eyes. The child was identified as William Whitmore, born January 15, 1898, to Henry and Margaret Whitmore. Henry, a prosperous textile merchant, had provided his family with a fashionable townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue, the very symbol of Boston affluence at the turn of the century. But prosperity had not shielded them from tragedy, and as Dr. Mitchell read further, she felt the threads of a dark story tighten around the fragile portrait she had first removed from its archival sleeve. According to the official birth records, William Whitmore had entered the world as a healthy child, and his family physician, Dr. Edmund Clark, described him at his 6-month examination as robust, strong, and well-developed. The portrait session at Morrison's studio was held on September 12, 1898, when William was just 8 months old. Family letters preserved in the Whitmore estate revealed the excitement surrounding the event, with Margaret Whitmore writing to her sister, "We are having dear William's portrait taken at the finest studio in Boston. Mr. Morrison assures us that the photograph will be a treasure we can cherish forever." What should have been a joyful occasion instead marked the beginning of a tragedy that would cast its shadow over the Whitmore family for generations. In the medical archives of Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. Mitchell discovered William's treatment records written by Dr. Clark. His entry for September 13th, the day after the session, noted, "Patient exhibits symptoms of severe gastric distress, lethargy, and unusual pallor following portrait session. Parents report child has been listless and refusing food since yesterday afternoon. Pupils remain constricted despite normal lighting conditions. Recommend immediate observation and treatment." The following entries told the story of a rapid and devastating decline. On September 15th, Dr. Clark wrote of worsening symptoms, persistent vomiting, irregular breathing, and a grayish cast overtaking the child's once healthy skin. The parents described him as hollow-eyed, unresponsive, and slipping further from vitality with every passing hour. The final entry, dated September 18th, 1898, delivered the crushing conclusion: despite all medical intervention, young William Whitmore expired this morning at 6:42 a.m. Cause of death remains unclear, though symptoms suggest possible poisoning by unknown substance. Parents report no known exposure to toxic materials. Recommend further investigation. Reading those words, Dr. Mitchell realized the chilling truth. William's portrait had unknowingly documented the first visible stages of a fatal poisoning, likely administered during what his unsuspecting parents believed was a routine photographic sitting. This revelation drove Dr. Mitchell to expand her investigation, searching for other infant deaths that might be connected to Morrison's studio. What she uncovered was more disturbing than she had anticipated. Cross-referencing death certificates from the Massachusetts State Archives, she identified 6 additional infant fatalities between 1896 and 1899, each occurring within days of a session at Morrison's Beacon Hill establishment. Though easily lost amid the high infant mortality rates of the 1890s, the similarities across these cases were undeniable. Each child had been reportedly healthy prior to the portrait, only to fall ill within hours, suffering from gastric distress, respiratory complications, profound lethargy, and the same eerie physical signs: a pallid, grayish complexion and constricted pupils. The evidence suggested not coincidence but a pattern, an overlooked string of tragedies pointing toward a sinister practice at the heart of Morrison's celebrated studio. Death most often struck within 3 to 7 days of the photographic sitting, a pattern chilling in its precision. Among the cases Dr. Mitchell examined, the most extensively documented was that of 8-month-old Charlotte Peaton, who died in November 1898. Her attending physician, Dr. Samuel Morco, had harbored suspicions grave enough to seek a consultation with a toxicologist. In his report to the Boston Board of Health, Morco wrote, The rapidity of decline and distinctive symptom pattern suggests deliberate administration of a toxic substance, possibly opium-based compounds or similar narcotic agents. He went on to state, "It is my professional opinion that infant Piton was subjected to a narcotic dose sufficient to maintain docility throughout the duration of a portrait sitting, but administered in excess, resulting in fatal toxicity." The timing of symptom onset immediately following the session cannot be regarded as coincidental. Yet despite the force of his words, Dr. Mitchell uncovered no indication that the Board of Health had acted on his warning. The concerns appeared to have been dismissed or quietly buried, likely smothered beneath Morrison's sterling reputation and his connections among Boston's wealthiest families. What disturbed Dr. Mitchell further was the evidence that Morrison had been deliberately targeting vulnerable children. In an 1897 issue of the Boston Society Review, she found a boldly worded advertisement. "Morrison Photography specializes in portraits of delicate children. Our gentle techniques ensure that even the most restless or unwell infants will remain perfectly calm and still throughout the session." On its surface, the wording suggested care and compassion, but in context, it was far more sinister. An open invitation to families of sickly children who would be less likely to question a sudden decline or to resist explanations that attributed death to fragile health rather than malice. The turning point in Dr. Mitchell's investigation came when she traced Morrison's chemical supplies to the Pearson Company Pharmaceutical, a Boston firm active from 1885 until 1902. Pearson's ledgers revealed Morrison as a regular client, and the quantities he purchased told their own damning story. While his 1896 orders of laudanum, a liquid opium tincture known for its potent but dangerous sedative effects, were modest by 1898. The scale of his purchases had swelled alarmingly far beyond what could be justified for household or incidental use. Morrison was procuring enough to dose multiple infants on a regular basis. Even more incriminating was the correspondence that accompanied the orders. One letter dated March 1898 bore Morrison's own words, a request for additional supplies of your finest laudanum preparation to be used, as he explained, for the calming of nervous subjects during extended photographic sessions. With that discovery, the shadow surrounding Morrison's studio deepened into a portrait not of artistry, but of calculated and systematic harm disguised as professional care. The response, preserved in Pearson Company's files, revealed that the pharmacist, Mr. George Pierce, had not been blind to the danger. In his reply, he cautioned, "While we understand that photographic work requires patient subjects, the quantities you are requesting seem excessive for such purposes. We recommend consulting with a physician regarding appropriate dosages for your intended use." His words were restrained, but clearly conveyed unease. Morrison's reply, dated April 1898, stripped away any pretense of innocence. "I appreciate your concerns," he wrote, "but my clientele expects the highest quality results, which require subjects to remain absolutely motionless for extended periods. The amounts I require are calculated based on the specific needs of infant photography, where even the slightest movement can ruin a session." The letter exposed his cold calculation. The suffering of children was secondary to the flawless stillness he demanded for his portraits. The most damning evidence surfaced in the order record from August 1898, a mere month before William Whitmore's fatal sitting. Morrison requested his largest shipment yet of laudanum, specifying in a chilling note that he required preparations of maximum potency for an upcoming series of important infant commissions. This was no accident, no careless misuse. It was a deliberate escalation, proof that Morrison had been systematically dosing infants with increasingly lethal amounts of narcotic in pursuit of perfect photographs for Boston's wealthiest families. Those parents, reassured by the serenity of their children in the studio, never suspected that the unnatural calm was bought with poison. The haunting intensity in William Whitmore's eyes, captured forever in the 1898 portrait, was no mere quirk of Victorian photographic technique. It was the gaze of a child in the grip of narcotic toxicity, already succumbing to a poison administered under the guise of professional expertise. To confirm her growing certainty, Dr. Mitchell turned to Dr. Patricia Henley, a forensic pathologist renowned for her work in historical toxicology. She presented Henley with both the enhanced digital images of William's portrait and the original medical records from 1898. After a careful review, Henley's conclusions were unflinching. The symptoms documented in these records are absolutely consistent with opium poisoning in infants, she explained. The constricted pupils, gastric distress, respiratory depression, and the distinctive pallor all point toward narcotic toxicity. Her examination of the enhanced photograph added a final chilling layer of confirmation. Looking at this image with modern forensic knowledge, Henley observed, "I see unmistakable evidence of the child's compromised state." The pinpoint pupils visible in the photograph are a textbook indicator of opium intoxication. The waxy skin tone, the unnatural translucency, and the hollow darkness beneath the eyes suggest the body was already entering the early stages of systemic poisoning when the camera shutter clicked. With that assessment, the truth was laid bare. Morrison's celebrated portraits were not innocent art, but silent witnesses to a string of preventable deaths. The forensic pathologist continued with a grim certainty. What is especially disturbing, Dr. Henley explained, is that the dosage required to render an infant this docile lies perilously close to the threshold of lethality. Morrison was effectively balancing on a razor's edge between sedation and death with every single session, and the records show that he miscalculated with fatal consequences more than once. She then helped Dr. Mitchell reconstruct the timeline of William Whitmore's poisoning. From the documented symptoms and their progression, Henley determined that the laudanum must have been administered 30 to 60 minutes before the photograph was taken. The effects would have been swift, producing the eerie stillness, rigid posture, and unblinking gaze that made the portrait so sought after by Boston's elite. The irony was devastating. The qualities that wealthy families cherished in Morrison's infant portraits, the serene calm, the unnatural lack of fidgeting, the uncanny direct gaze, were not signs of artistry or angelic composure, but unmistakable markers of systemic poisoning. This photograph, Henley concluded, pointing to William's image on the screen, is not just a family keepsake. It is documentation of a crime in progress. That child's eyes are not alert or aware. They are reflecting the neurological collapse of narcotic intoxication. It is nothing short of miraculous that any of Morrison's subjects survived their sessions. For Dr. Mitchell, the realization was crushing. The Whitmore portrait was not only a relic of family history, but forensic evidence of murder preserved for over a century in a family Bible. Her continuing investigation uncovered that Morrison's methods had indeed drawn attention within Boston's medical community, but attempts to sound the alarm had been deliberately suppressed. The conspiracy stretched beyond one studio. It implicated members of Boston's most powerful families and civic leaders who had both patronized and protected Morrison. The turning point came when Dr. Mitchell located the private papers of Dr. James Thornfield, the pediatrician whose 1899 article had cautiously hinted at sedation practices. Hidden among his personal correspondence was a cache of letters that stripped away his professional restraint and revealed his urgent efforts to expose Morrison. In a letter to the Boston Police Commissioner, dated November 1898, Thornfield declared, "I have now treated 7 infants who have exhibited identical symptoms following portrait sessions at Morrison Photography Studio. The pattern is unmistakable. These children are being deliberately poisoned with narcotic substances. I formally request an immediate investigation into Mr. Morrison's practices." The commissioner's response, preserved in Thornfield's files, was curt and dismissive. "While we appreciate your concerns, Dr. Thornfield, we cannot launch investigations based on speculation about legitimate business practices. Mr. Morrison serves some of our city's most respected families, and we have received no complaints regarding his services." Undeterred, Thornfield pressed forward. His letters chronicled his growing determination as he compiled the names of affected families, documented case histories, and even secured samples of the very substances Morrison had been using. In one desperate plea to the Massachusetts Board of Health, he wrote, "I possess physical evidence of laudanum residue found on clothing worn by infants during Morrison sessions. This evidence cannot be ignored. Chemical analysis confirms concentration sufficient to cause the deaths I have documented." With those words, Dr. Thornfield's report should have prompted immediate action. Yet the response he received from the Massachusetts Board of Health was chilling in its indifference. In a letter signed by Director Harrison Blackwell, the board dismissed his findings outright. "Dr. Thornfield, your persistent allegations against a respected member of our business community are becoming disruptive to public confidence. We advise you to cease this line of inquiry unless you wish to face professional sanctions." For Dr. Mitchell, the significance was unmistakable. Her research uncovered that Blackwell's own grandson had been photographed by Morrison in early 1898 and had survived. The revelation explained the board's hostility. Those in power were shielding Morrison not out of ignorance, but out of self-preservation, desperate to avoid scandal that might tarnish their names and reputations. The final heartbreaking confirmation of the cover-up came in a letter Thornfield wrote to his brother in December 1898. The words conveyed the despair of a man crushed by institutional corruption. "They have made it clear that pursuing this matter further will end my medical career in Boston. I am being forced to choose between justice for these murdered children and my ability to help future patients. God forgive me, but I cannot sacrifice my practice and destroy my family for a battle I cannot win." With that, Thornfield's campaign collapsed, silenced by the very authorities sworn to protect the vulnerable. Dr. Mitchell's investigation revealed that Morrison's sinister practices persisted into early 1899, unchecked until one case brought his work to an abrupt halt. This final turning point involved the daughter of Judge Marcus Wellington, a man of towering influence within Boston's legal establishment. The near death of 8-month-old Victoria Wellington during her portrait session finally ended Morrison's deadly methods. Records from the Massachusetts Historical Society preserved the Wellington family's ordeal. In February 1899, Victoria was taken to Morrison's studio for her portrait, but unlike other parents, Judge Wellington insisted on remaining in the room. He had grown wary of Morrison's insistence that mothers and fathers wait outside for optimal photographic conditions. His suspicion proved well-founded. In his personal diary later discovered among family papers, the judge documented what transpired. Morrison administered what he called a mild calming tonic to Victoria, assuring me it was common practice for infant photography. Within minutes, my daughter became unnaturally still, her eyes glassy and hollow in a way that filled me with dread. The diary's account grew darker still. When I demanded to know what substance Morrison had given my child, he became evasive, insisting it was nothing more than sugar water with a harmless herbal additive. Yet Victoria's condition worsened steadily before my eyes, and by the end of the session, she was scarcely responsive. Her pallor was alarming, her breathing shallow, and I feared she would not survive the day. The words of a father and a judge, powerful, credible, and damning, marked the moment when Morrison's unchecked crimes could no longer be ignored. Judge Wellington wasted no time after the harrowing portrait session. He carried his daughter straight to Dr. James Thornfield, whose examination confirmed his worst fears. Victoria exhibited every hallmark of laudanum poisoning: the constricted pupils, shallow breathing, and pallid skin. But unlike the other infants who had succumbed, Victoria had been brought for medical attention almost immediately, and her life was saved. Survival, however, came at a terrible cost. The narcotics effects left her with permanent neurological damage that impaired her development for the rest of her life. Unlike grieving parents who had lacked influence, Judge Wellington possessed both power and determination. His diary revealed the extent of his private investigation, in which he connected the suspicious infant deaths that had surrounded Morrison's studio for years. "My inquiry has uncovered what cannot be denied," he wrote. "Morrison has been systematically poisoning babies under the guise of portraiture. The toll is at least 8 dead children, perhaps more. This man is no artist. He is a serial killer who murders infants in pursuit of his reputation." The confrontation between Wellington and Morrison was decisive. Faced with the wrath of a prominent judge, Morrison fled Boston in haste. But the city's elite, desperate to protect themselves from scandal and exposure, ensured he would not face a trial. Instead, they allowed him to depart quietly, erasing the threat of public proceedings that might reveal their complicity in shielding him for so long. On March 15, 1899, Morrison's final advertisement appeared in the Boston Herald. "Morrison Photography regretfully announces the closure of our Boston studio due to the owner's relocation to pursue opportunities in Europe. We thank our valued clientele for their patronage." Yet Dr. Mitchell's exhaustive research proved the claim false. Passenger lists revealed no record of Morrison's departure across the Atlantic, and after March of 1899, his name vanished from all official records as if swallowed whole by the shadows of history. Dr. Mitchell closed her investigation with the heavy knowledge that Edgar Morrison had never been held accountable. Still, she vowed his victims would no longer remain invisible. Her work identified at least 8 infants murdered, and many more poisoned their deaths, buried beneath silence and respectability. The haunting 1898 portrait of William Whitmore became the centerpiece of a landmark exhibition entitled "Hidden Crimes When Photographs Reveal Historical Injustice." Hosted at the National Archives and displayed in partnership with Boston Children's Hospital and the Massachusetts Historical Society, the exhibition paired the portraits with medical records correspondence and forensic analysis that laid bare the truth of Morrison's crimes. Working with descendants of the families, Dr. Mitchell ensured each child was named, remembered, and honored. Many of the families had unknowingly preserved their children's portraits as cherished heirlooms, never realizing they were gazing upon evidence of calculated murder. Now those images stood not only as remnants of grief, but as testimonies, silent witnesses, finally given a voice more than a century after the crimes were committed. When Dr. Mitchell reached out to the Whitmore descendants, she met with Catherine Whitmore Chen Williams' great-niece, who had donated the portrait without any knowledge of its dark history. As Mitchell carefully explained the investigation's finding, Catherine's voice faltered. "I always wondered why baby William looked so unusual in that portrait," she said softly. "My grandmother used to say there was something sad about his eyes, but we never knew why. Now I understand. He was dying when that photograph was taken, Doctor." Mitchell, her expression grave, replied, "Your ancestor's portrait became evidence that survived for over 125 years. William's eyes told a story no one at the time was willing to hear. But at last, his gaze has brought justice to him and to the other children Morrison murdered." The exhibition that followed did more than memorialize the victims. It laid bare the corruption that had shielded Morrison, exposing the complicity of Boston's elite, who had chosen silence over scandal. Visitors learned not only of the infant deaths, but of the deliberate cover-up that allowed a child killer to operate under the banner of respectability. Dr. Mitchell's investigation extended beyond Boston, uncovering evidence that Morrison likely continued his practices in other cities under assumed names. His trail of crime scattered across state lines, hidden beneath the same veil of wealth and influence. In her final report, Mitchell reflected on the broader significance of the case. This investigation demonstrates that historical photographs can serve as powerful forensic evidence of crimes long concealed. William Whitmore's haunting gaze, preserved in a family Bible for more than a century, has at last given voice to victims silenced by a conspiracy of privilege and power. His image shows us that truth sometimes endures, not in the official histories written by the powerful, but in the eyes of the innocent, whose suffering was buried until technology and determination uncovered their story. The Whitmore portrait remained at the National Archives as a permanent artifact, its unsettling image transformed from a private memento into a public testimony. Those eyes which had once stared into a Victorian camera while their owner slipped slowly toward death now bore witness across time. They stood as guardians of memory, ensuring that William's murder and the murders of at least 7 other children would never again be forgotten. Their silent plea finally answered more than a century after the shutter closed.